Mat or Ma'at, the goddess of order.
The ancient Egyptian goddess of truth, justice, and the cosmic order. Ma'at or Mayet was responsible for regulating both the stars and the seasons. Venerated as an important deity during the Old Kingdom period, she was considered as the daughter of Atum, and as such implied the superiority of order, justice, and even harmony. Pertaining to these aspects, the Ma'at was envisaged as a guideline for human behavior that would conform to the will of the gods, thus in the process of establishing a universal order. This cosmic balance was also reflected in the studies of the ancient Egyptian astronomers, who charted the Earth's orbit with the celestial paths of the stars and other planets. Simply put, this ambit of balance was perceived as a principle that was to be adopted by the Egyptians in their daily lives, which in turn established the virtues of truth, family life, and belief system centered around the various deities. And when it comes to her physical appearance, Ma'at was often depicted as a winged woman with an ostrich feather on her head. The latter apparel had symbolic significance since the feather of Ma'at was the instrumental object in the weighing of the heart ceremony in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that after their death, the heart of their soul was to be weighed against the feather in a scale of justice, which would allow the sections of their spirits to be ultimately released to Ak, or the composite soul.
Ptah, the creator god, venerated as a deity of life crafts. Ptah is one of the Egyptian gods who formed the triad of Mephes, the personification of creation. Ptah was perceived as the ultimate of fashion and the birthed life. Ptah was also hailed as the self-created one, and for his physical nature, Ptah was often depicted as a mummified bearded man with a green skin. His arms were kept free to hold a scepter, and his overall profile contained the three powerful symbols of ancient Egyptian religion: the Wa scepter, the ensign of life, and the Djinn pillar. This was all combined essence of his creative prowess: the power, life-giving ability, and stability.
Nut, the starry goddess venerated as the deity of the sky.
The daughter of Shu, goddess of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture and rain, Nut embodied the sky, stars, and the larger cosmos. In that regard, she was often represented with an overarching body over the earth, which, in return, was personified by Nut's brother and husband Jib. In terms of history, Nut was considered as one of the oldest Egyptian gods, with her lore harking back to the founding story of Heliopolis, a city that corresponds to a present-day Cairo suburb that had been inhabited since pre-dynastic period, circa 3100 before Christ. One hypothesis relates to how she was initially regarded as the goddess of nighttime sky, but later morphed into the embodiment of the entire heavenly sky. Some of the mythical narratives from ancient Egypt pertain to how Nut, as the sky, mates with her husband, the earth, to give birth to a host of powerful Egyptian gods like Osiris, Isis, and Set. But the birthings had to be hidden from Ra, embodying the sun, who decreed that Nut couldn't use any days of the year for giving birth, because he feared that his throne might be usurped by the successive generation born by the union of the sky and the earth. However, the god Thoth comes to Nut's rescue by adding 5 more epagomenal days in a year, which originally comprised 360 days. He achieves the feat by tricking Khonsu, the god of moon, and thus the births are given during 5 days illuminated by the moonlight instead of the sun. In case, Nut was often depicted wearing a waterpot headdress with a waterpot sign, which is NW, signifying her very name.
Isis, the Egyptian goddess associated with royalty and magic. Probably the most famous of all Egyptian goddess, Isis, was initially associated with Hathor, thus being heralded as the personification of many of these motherly qualities. However, she further rose in significance during the Old Kingdom period as one of the prominent characters of the Osiris myth, in which she not only resurrects her murdered husband, the divine king Osiris, but also successfully gave birth and protect his heir Horus. This narrative was symbolically mirrored in the affair of the ancient Egyptian state, with the very name Isis being derived from Egyptian Iset, the Set, which referred to the throne. In essence, the Egyptian goddess was perceived as the divine mother of the king, while Horus was associated with the pharaohs themselves. This analogy, the throne was also prevalent in the very depiction of Isis, with her original headdress carrying an empty throne that signified the set of her slain husband. Over time, Isis given various epithets like Queret Kiko, the great magic, and even Nut Netjer, the mother of the gods. Judging by these titles, it doesn't come as a surprise that Isis overtook all the previous Egyptian goddesses in popularity. So much so that later on some of them were relegated to mere aspect of Isis. Moreover, the duration of the goddess also reached beyond the traditional boundaries of ancient Egypt to account for the persistent cult that was spread across the later Greco-Roman world.
Osiris, the dead god, venerated as a deity of the underworld. One of the major ancient Egyptian gods during and after the Old Kingdom period, Osiris, the husband of Isis, the father of Horus, and the brother of Set, was often perceived as the king of the underworld, a part of the later formed Abydos triad, comprising him, his wife, and his son. Osiris was possibly the only Egyptian deity who was directly referred to simply as a god, thus alluding his immense prominence among the ancient Egyptian worshippers. In addition to his role as the lord of the underworld, a title that was passed to him after his murder by his brother Set, Osiris was also regarded as the god of transition, since the death in itself was not seen as an absolute condition, and even regeneration. Furthermore, Osiris also fulfilled his duty as the judge of the dead, as he was the central figure who decided the deceased's fate after the aforementioned weighing of the heart ceremony. Interestingly enough, in such pieces, we can comprehend the pragmatic nature of ancient Egyptian gods and religion, since, as opposed to advocating Puritan morality, the deceased was only expected to live a balanced former life. Finally, coming the physical attributes of Osiris, the god was often depicted as a mummified, bearded king with green or black skin, to represent both death and resurrection. And as a living god, Osiris was represented rather ostentatiously as a handsome man in the royal attire wearing the crown of the Upper Egypt, a headdress known as the Atef, while carrying the crook and flail, both symbols of kingship.
Horus, the falcon god.
Horus, venerated as a deity of war and kingship. The most well-known of all Avian Egyptian gods, Horus was also possibly one of the first known national Egyptian gods who was worshipped in various forms and aspects from the pre-dynastic period to the Roman Egypt. However, there are at least 6 known Horus entities that are mentioned in Egyptian mythology, and we will only talk about the deity otherwise hailed as Horus the Younger, the son of Osiris and Isis, and the rival of Set, his father's murderer. Completing the Abydos triad, Horus was regarded as a powerful sky god who was designated as the divine protector of the pharaohs. His legacy is also fueled by his mythical battle against the adversary, Set, from which Horus emerged victorious, thereby uniting the two lands of Egypt, albeit after losing one of his eyes. In essence, the avenging Egyptian deity was also perceived as a god of war whose name was frequently invoked before actual battles by the rulers and commanders. As for his physical attributes, Horus, especially when combined with the sun god Ra to form Ra-Harak, was usually depicted as a falcon-headed man wearing the cent, the symbol of kingship over unified Egypt. On the other hand, his restored eye, personified as the Eye of Horus, was the ancient Egyptian symbol for protection and sacrifice. Quite intriguingly, the Ptolemaic dynasty favored another form of Horus known as Harpocrates, or Horus the Child, who was depicted as a winged child with a finger on his lips, suggesting the virtue of silence and keeping secrets.
Set, the antagonist god, regarded as the deity of chaos. Set was portrayed as the antagonist among the Egyptian gods and responsible for murdering his brother Osiris. Set was perceived as a divine entity since the pre-dynastic period. He was also originally regarded as a more or less benevolent and esteemed entity who sometimes served as an ally of Ra. But over the time, he was also associated with peculiar and frightening phenomena like eclipses, storms, and thunders, suggesting as a dark side of his personification. Native Egyptian also saw Set as an agent of evil. And lastly, the later Egyptian period, artists tended to depict Set exclusively with a donkey head.
Me, the lord of the eastern desert, venerated as the deity of eternity.
Min was among the oldest of the deities worshipped by the ancient Egyptians, whose origins go back to the pre-dynastic period of late 4th millennium before Christ. It is entirely possible the cult of the early era tended to worship objects like the barbed arrow as a symbol of the god. Over time, he was endowed with a human form and often represented through double-headed arrows resembling Min's standard. In the centuries leading up the Middle Kingdom, circa pre-20th century before Christ, Min was regarded as the deity of Orion constellation and was often associated with both thunder and rain. The pyramid text also referred to Min as a patron of traveling caravans, traders, and miners, thereby making him the protector and lord of the eastern desert. By the Middle Kingdom era, circa 20th to 17th century before Christ, Min was increasingly perceived as a deity of fertility and male sexuality. During this period, the long-leafed lettuce was the symbol of Min, possibly because it was considered to be an aphrodisiac. The association with fertility also translated into the virile force of nature, mirrored by agriculture and verdancy, and thus harvests were celebrated with games and processions in his honor. By the New Kingdom era, the rituals of Min possibly alluded to the metaphorical male seed in the form of plant seeds that had to be sowed by the pharaoh to prove his virility. Furthermore, Min was perhaps also venerated as an aspect of Osiris, along with his worship as the composite god of Ptah, Min.
Anubis, the jackal god venerated as the guide of soul, passively the most visually recognizable of ancient Egyptian gods. Anubis, or rather Ampo or Empo in Egyptian language, was presented as the jackal-headed entity associated with the rites of embalming the deceased and the related afterlife. Unlike many contemporary Egyptian gods, Anubis have other aspects that these core attributes were seemingly always related to the matters of death. Anubis was perceived as a protector of graves, passively to indo a positive aspect to the propensity of jackals who tended to dig up shallow graves. To that end, Anubis pertained to one of the rare ancient Egyptian gods, who in spite of his ancient legacy, was not venerated in dedicated persons and temples. On the contrary, the tombs and mastabash of the dead were seen as his place to worship, including a particular shrine of Anibion, who contained the mummified remain of dog and jackal. Suffice to it say, Anubis was often intrinsically related to the rites associated with the dead, and thus he played the role of the deity who ushered soul into an afterlife. Over time, he might have even overtaken Osiris to the main judge in the weighing of the heart ceremony as depicted in the scenes from the Book of the Dead. Now, in spite of his visually striking features and frequent ancient artistic depiction that, as we mentioned before, consisted of a black jackal head, Anubis played almost no part in the actual Egyptian mythology, and while the color black itself symbolizes both desolation and rebirth, Anubis was possibly also associated with the god Apuat or Whippoorwill, another deity with canine or dog features but with gray fur.
Thoth, the ibis god, venerated as a deity of writing and wisdom. Another one of the ancient Egyptian gods who was worshipped from the pre-dynastic period to the Greco-Roman times. Thoth was an important deity of writing, magic, wisdom, and the moon. He was also closely associated with the principles of balance and equilibrium, which was often symbolized by his title, Lord of Ma'at. And as such, Thoth was also portrayed as the husband of the goddess Ma'at, the deity of truth, justice, and the cosmic order. Quite interestingly, Thoth had many origin stories in the Egyptian mythology, with the older lore mentioning how Thoth was either born from the lip of Ra or was self-born as an ibis, which lays the cosmic eggs that holds all of the creation. Later origin myths establish Thoth as one of the characters of the Osiris saga, wherein the deity was oddly born when Set accidentally swallowed Horus' Set. In any case, given his stature as one of the major Egyptian gods of the balance, Thoth equally held and aided both the parties Horus and Set in their epic battle. As for his physical attributes, Thoth was often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis or sometimes even a seated baboon in his an aspect. And considering his academic qualities, Thoth was widely perceived as the patron deity of the scribes, astronomers, priests, and some rulers, like Thutmose, meaning born of Thoth. He was also credited as the inventor of the alphabet, mathematics, surveying, geometry, and even botany.
Zobek, the crocodile god.
Zobek, also called as Zebek, was an ancient Egyptian deity with a complex and fluid nature. He is associated with the Nile crocodile or the West African crocodile and is represented either in its form or as a human with a crocodile head. Some ancient Egyptian sects believed that Zobek created order in the universe and the world when he arose from the dark water, and that he was the creator of the Nile River. He was often associated with fertility. Interestingly enough, archaeologists have found mummified crocodiles of both adult and infant variety in ancient Egyptian tombs, which rather alludes to the popularity of Zobek as one of the major Egyptian gods. In fact, Zobek as a deity was venerated even during the Greco-Roman times.
Taweret, the Hippo goddess, regarded as a deity of protection. Taweret is the ancient Egyptian goddess of childbirth. Taweret meaning she who is great. She was also regarded as a divine protector of women and children. And interestingly enough, her venerations by the ancient Egyptians was possibly inspired by the ecological scope of the realm before the early dynastic period. The local observed how the female hippopotami staunchly defended their young offspring from harm. Taweret also worshipped as an Abrahamic god who had the power to avoid evil influences. By the time of New Kingdom, Taweret, her likeness was also designed on objects related to femininity, like cosmetic applicators, jewelry, headdress, and vessel. The physical attributes of Taweret also followed suit, with Egyptian goddess often portrayed as a pendle pregnant hippopotamus who carried protective as sign. However, her limbs were strikingly feline in nature, while her rear end resembled a Nile crocodile.
Khepri, the battle god associated with the morning sun, intrinsically connected to the scarab beetle, Khepri was one of the rare Egyptian gods who was usually depicted as a man with a beetle hid in ancient Egyptian funerary papyri. There was a symbolic side to the entity epitomizing the forces that move the sun across the vast expanse to the sky. This connection was derived from the action of scarab beetles emerge from inside the dome. From the age laid by the parent, is in fact related to the Egyptian word keeper, which roughly translates to change or to create. In any case, Khepri was also considered as being subordinate or to more exalted sun god Ra, which on occasion also translated to Khepri, being one of the aspects of Ra. The people also regarded Khepri as one of the Egyptian gods of rebirth, possibly since the Egyptians believed beetles appeared out of nowhere and yet were able to procreate.